Stopping gun violence remains a troubling topic dominating the news headlines, and new laws regarding gun control have been approved in at least 2 states. Now, of course, these changes are all of concern here with us at 91.9 and, of course, with you. So we're working to make sense of it all with the third of our series on gun control. Now, joining me today is Dr. David Kanervo. He's Austin Peay Professor Emeritus, and he's going to help us discuss political maneuvering that's sort of been happening in the wake of tragedies at Parkland, Florida, and, of course, not far away in Marshall County, Kentucky, and elsewhere. So first, Dr. Kanervo, let's talk about President Trump's gun plan from last month. Now, in February, of course, we had the Parkland tragedy happen, and Trump seemed to be feeling sort of agreeable with Democrats and Republicans about possibly age limits, even banning certain weapons. And then he changed his mind. What do you think this means, and how do you think it's going to affect things down the road?
Well, it's unclear what his change of mind means. It may be that someone who is more conservative in their position than what he was initially advocating may have talked with him and changed his mind. It may be that the NRA talked with him and changed his mind. So it's not clear, but at the same time, Trump is known for saying one thing one day and then changing it to something else a day or two later. So this is not necessarily anything terribly unusual for him.
Right, he sort of shoots from the hip pretty much anyway, right?
Right, right.
Now let's talk about one of the parts of that plan that's been really a big topic, I think, for a lot of people, and that's arming teachers particularly, or other suitable volunteers, which again, there was some talk about possibly veterans doing that. As a professor yourself, what do you think about the pros and cons of something like that?
Well, I remember when it was first being discussed in the Tennessee State Legislature a couple of years ago that faculty members on campuses could carry guns. And I went into class one day and asked my students what they thought, and there was almost unanimous opposition to me walking into class with a gun. So I'm not, whether that was me or whether it was the concept of faculty carrying guns that turned them off, I don't know. But certainly there was this feeling that maybe the fewer guns on campus, the better, not more. One of the concerns that Senator Marco Rubio of Florida had was that if we have teachers armed with guns, that it would be difficult for the first responders to necessarily be able to separate who was the teacher from who was the armed invader shooting up the school. And I think there's some merit to that concern, that unless teachers who are legally allowed to have guns in the schools are clearly identified, clearly marked somehow, that it would be difficult for a first responder. And of course, you're likely to have then casualties among those teachers as a result. And so that's a real problem. Also, one of the concerns I have about arming teachers is that if the teacher is not carrying the gun the entire time that she or he is on campus, then perhaps that gun would be subject to being stolen, lifted somehow from a desk drawer or whatever by a student, and so inadvertently giving that student a weapon with which to assault the school. So I think there are some problems there. At the same time, I know that there are people on Austin Peay's campus, for example, who do carry guns. They have registered as gun carriers. The same would be true, I would guess, in elementary and high schools. And so if someone is well-trained, well-versed, and perhaps if they are known to the first responders, to the campus police or SROs or local police department as someone with a legal carry permit and someone who is stationed in the school as a legitimate gun carrier, then perhaps some of the problems that I had mentioned might be alleviated somewhat. But I guess I tend to operate from the philosophy that the more guns there are, the greater danger there might be for an accident to occur or for someone who is innocent to be hurt, if not killed, by the weapon. So while I don't have a firm opinion, I tend to lean against arming teachers, at least at this point.
Yeah, definitely pros and cons, as you mentioned, for teachers. Now, what about the volunteers, maybe veterans? For instance, obviously we're in close proximity. Perhaps we had veterans from Fort Campbell who might be part of this, certain volunteers. What about the concerns about a post-traumatic stress disorder that could maybe be an issue?
Sure, I think that's a problem. Someone would have to be very carefully screened before they were allowed in as a volunteer to carry a weapon and to essentially provide security at the school. At the same time, my bias is that there would need to be perhaps an age limit. I don't know that an old person like me would necessarily be the kind of person you would want to have at a school to provide security. There would need to be, I think, veterans who are in their 40s, 50s perhaps, who are in good physical condition, very mentally alert, and of course well trained, as probably a veteran would be in armaments. But they would have to be well versed in the protocols of the school, so that with the changing of classes and who's doing what, and particularly with the ROTC folks, that they would have a very clear understanding as to who was responsible for doing what and who could do what they were doing.
Yeah, there's a lot of room for error with all those many moving parts.
Sure.
I agree with you completely on that. Now let's shift a little bit to background checks. Obviously, another part of the plan that the president has talked about is really cracking down on those systems, those agencies rather, that don't submit their criminal records like they should to that national basic database to allow people to check. What about that concern too? Does that also, you think, be a worthwhile situation?
Well, I think it is a problem. Of course, we've seen some situations, 2 or 3 that I can think of, where background checks were not submitted. I think the Air Force was guilty in one case, and maybe another agency in another case. And those are vital, that they be submitted on time and taken very seriously to prevent people who have some sort of background problem, so that they don't get guns legally. And the background checks, I think, are an important cog, and that's unfortunately one of the problems that happens when you have government regulation, and that is that you've got to have a successful chain of action from step 1 to step X. And if there's a breakdown in that chain of action from one step to another, then of course the policy, the law, doesn't become effective, and problems occur. And so it's vitally important that the number of steps be reduced to minimize the chance of breakdown, but also that there be a real focus on making sure that there are responsible people in the positions who will phone in the checks, do the checks, and respond quickly.
Yeah, because I just was thinking, law enforcement, they depend on that database so much. I mean, just for their day-to-day, obviously, operation. And of course, like you said, if there's one piece missing, it just kind of makes the whole thing not as worthwhile as it would have been.
And I suspect most of us have been in situations where we'll say, well, this is important for me to do, but I'm going to break for lunch and come back and do it later. And then they forget about it, or something else comes up and distracts them from doing that. And so sometimes later doesn't happen, unfortunately, and that can be a crucially important problem.
Yeah, human failure
Yes.
is unfortunate, definitely,
Yes.
and yeah, not a laughing matter at all. Now, the president's plan also calls for states themselves to pass what are called risk protection orders to make it, or they're like a temporary restraining order to allow law enforcement to take away firearms from people who might be deemed dangerous. What do you feel about those measures too?
Well, I think that's legitimate. We have psychological tests and laws now where if someone who has had a history of mental illness or might be considered to be mentally ill is considered to be a danger to herself or himself or a danger to others, that the law can intervene, at least temporarily, to check that person out and see what's going on. And I would see the same thing as being a legitimate step for the law to take in regard to guns as well. If someone who is a normally very calm individual and who is passed the test to be a open carry holder of a gun, then if they're acting strange, unusual, then I would think that having them checked out to make sure that they're not likely to become violent with the gun is a good thing.
Definitely is. And of course, mental health cares was a big part also of this plan as well. And I think we need to talk about it a little bit more. There are these hopes that the president has to sort of integrate mental health care as part of like a bigger sort of plan, family plan. But with the skyrocketing costs of health care, and many people are already struggling to get some kind of health care, how feasible is this? How can it happen realistically?
Well, that's a good point. The cost is high. And it seems to me there's another aspect of it as well that concerns me some, and that is not all mental health professionals necessarily agree on a diagnosis or agree on an evaluation of a particular person. And so there might be what might be considered the weak link in the diagnosis chain, meaning that there is some healthcare professional who tends to be a little bit more lenient and trusting of the patient, and perhaps not as careful as someone else might be. And one other aspect of that is, of course, the testing of students in school, elementary and secondary schools. If we're going to go that route and say that it's the individual that kills people and not guns, as some do say, then we've got to be very careful about, obviously, who owns a gun. And that means testing people, I would think, from a very early age, maybe 4th, 5th grade, so that literally, if you're going to do this well, every single student would have to have a psychological analysis, every single one. And that would have to be done at least a year, every year or every 2 years at a minimum, in order to identify people who, as they develop, might develop into problems.
Definitely an interesting thought.
And the question is, of course, are parents going to be happy that their Janie or John is being given a psychological analysis? It gets into issues of privacy, healthcare privacy, of course, and it gets into issues of can the schools afford to do that, where the record's going to be kept, those sorts of things. And while it seems to me if we're going to take the attitude that guns are not the problem but people are, then we've got to have real restraints and real testing and diagnoses of people and treat that very seriously and very comprehensively.
And I think that takes us right back again to our issue of, again, with healthcare and that sort of need that, if you, like you said, if it is indeed a people situation, putting that money and time behind that, when schools are already struggling to meet the benchmarks that they need for reading and arithmetic and all the other things that they're required to by the government, then you add this whole psychological, psychiatric evaluation factor in. It's going to be putting teachers in another kind of crunch probably they wouldn't expect.
Sure, and of course, can the schools hire enough psychologists to test students? Is there even a protocol available that psychologists can follow to find out whether someone might be prone toward violence, and particularly gun violence? As not being a psychologist, I don't know whether that exists, but certainly that would need to be developed if it does not currently exist, some sort of interview protocol, is what I'm thinking, so that 10, 12, 13-year-olds can be screened adequately for their mental health.
Definitely. Now, if you're just tuning in and joining us here at 91.9, I'm Micca, Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs. Joining me is Dr. David Kanervo, Professor Emeritus. We're discussing gun control and obviously the political ramifications, of course, mental health care and health care involved as well. So let's talk a little bit more about President Trump's plan, which we began kind of dissecting here. We did, of course, in the whole situation with Parkland, remember the FBI has sort of been under scrutiny as a result of the several calls to their tip line regarding Nicholas Cruz and the concerns about his behavior and his posting things on YouTube. Do you think that a tip line is still probably the best way maybe for information about a possible excuse me, school shooter to be reported, or what about that whole situation?
I think a tip line is one means, certainly, by which the FBI or the local police can be alerted to someone who parents or other adults consider to be a danger. At the same time, I don't know that a tip line is necessarily adequate in and of itself. I come back again to this notion that if we're really worried about students, a tip line is not going to be adequate. That Mr. Kuntz in Florida was an obvious case where he was very outgoing in his problem and was very easy to identify generally based on the YouTube and the tip lines that were used. But there are going to be students, particularly I think the one in Marshall County was not so outgoing.
Right.
He was a quieter individual. And in his case, the tip line, it seems to me, would not have been useful, and wasn't useful, obviously, because people didn't anticipate that this young man was someone who would be a problem and a shooter. And I think the profile of shooters is frequently that they are quiet, that they're loners, that they tend to keep things bottled up inside frequently. It may be at least somewhat evident to the family members, those who are close to them, but to outsiders, really not so much. And so it seems to me that it's that kind of person that really needs to be identified by in-school analysis.
Definitely. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the Parkland case. Obviously, he was a teen and he owned a weapon legally. And we have at least 2 states now, Florida and Vermont, who say we need to change that age and move it up to 21 as part of those laws. But apparently then there's concern about doing that. Is that going to be a good thing? Of course, President Trump says, no, I don't think that that's necessarily the best thing. I want my new federal commission to look at that. What are your thoughts about changing the age? Because apparently recent polls show that most Americans want that raised.
Yeah. Well, I'd certainly be in favor of it. Anytime you can perhaps at least eliminate some possibility of a teenager from getting a dangerous weapon, I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, I understand that it is not necessarily a major fix to the problem. I suspect there are plenty of teenagers who know that the drinking age is 21, but who were able to get a buddy to get them a case of beer. Mm-hmm. Or a bottle of whiskey or something else illegal for their age. And my fear would be that the same would be true with guns, or that, and done innocently, in that, look, I want to go hunting with my father, but I don't have a gun. At the same time, the fact that 18 or 19-year-olds might be forbidden from buying a gun doesn't mean they couldn't take it out of their parents' closet or wherever a parent or a friend might have it, particularly if it's in an unsecured position, so that it doesn't have a trigger lock. It may have bullets in it or nearby, so that I think there are some problems with just simply raising the age limit, that there are ways of getting around that so that that is not going to be a simple fix to the problem.
Right, and I want to mention gun shows to you too, and an online gun sales. Again, a gun show, like you mentioned, maybe a teen goes with their family and goes to this gun show and they're able to get their hands on something that they wouldn't be able to normally. Again, legislating a gun show is pretty difficult.
Sure, it's very difficult, and of course, if there's a neighborhood swap meet or a neighborhood yard sale or whatever it might be, that's a difficult thing. My father owned a shotgun, double-barrel shotgun, and a single-shot .22 when I was growing up. Now, when they moved, they were, I think, I never knew what happened to them, but I think they were sold probably in their yard sale.
Wow. So, yeah, anybody can get their
anyone
hands
could
on
have
them.
gotten them.
Right, definitely. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the federal task force that President Trump wants to have look at the issue of age, of course, and other regulations with guns. Now, of course, this task force was led by Betsy DeVos, who's the education secretary. But they've been given no deadline on when they're supposed to have their work done. Now, how common is that a task force, particularly at that level, is given a pretty big task to tackle and not given a set time to do that? How common is that?
I can't say among all the task forces how common it is, but it does seem to me that if there is a matter of having a great deal of certainty that that people want something to be done, that there ought to be some sort of time limit, a goal that they can work toward so that it doesn't stretch out for forever. And so I think that would be somewhat bothersome, I believe, not to have a time limit that people can work towards, saying that this is when we want to start taking some serious steps about this problem.
And of course, the students who survived the Parkland horrible, and also the one in Marshall County, and of course many others, Columbine, and they've really stepped up to say, hey, we want some answers now. We want something now. They've gone and spoken to lawmakers and said, we need to do this. They protested. They've done all sorts of things. How important do you think that these young voices are in this particular issue?
Well, I think they are important. Unfortunately, they have been somewhat denigrated, and I know that one or two of them have received threats of various kinds, death threats and other things. And I find that very distasteful, that because they are exercising their First Amendment right to speak out, to petition government, that older adults would threaten them in that way. I find that terrible, not only because of the individual threat, but also because it's a clear violation of First Amendment rights to not allow them to speak out on an issue which obviously affects them very directly. And my hope is that the students, through their activities, if they can keep it up and keep the pressure on, will have some effect that older adults have not been able to do over the years. At the same time, I think that ultimately what's going to keep the state legislators and the national legislators from simply thumbing their nose at the students is for the students to actually show up and vote. Mm-hmm. That is crucial. Obviously, you can vote at the age of 18 today, and showing some legislators who may be defeated that in fact they need to listen to what the students say, because they will lose their seat, I think is crucial. As a political scientist, I know that students, young people up to the age of 25, tend to be the lowest turnout group among voters. Mm-hmm. And that really needs to change. The students need to become active. What I have harped on for 40 years as a teacher is that students really have the most to gain and to lose. They're the ones who have 70, 80 years of life, most of us, ahead of them.
Right.
And whether it's guns or whether it's the state of the economy and jobs, whether it's the environment, whether it's something else, students need to understand that they have a real stake in the future, and that who they elect today at 18 or 19 or 20 years of age will have an impact on their future, whether it be the amount of taxes they pay, whether it's the state of the roads, or again, whatever policy area it might be. It's important that they develop positions on these issues and take them seriously. Now, I know that students who are 19, 20, 21 years of age are just getting started in life. They'll be getting married perhaps, if they're not married already, getting married soon. They will have job searches, they'll be starting jobs, they'll be looking for places to live. There are all sorts of foundational things that happen in a person's life that students are obviously concerned with, and reasonably so. But I know I'm biased because of my background, but politics happens every day. Public policy happens every day of our lives. And it's up to students to take that seriously and to get involved. Small d democracy requires student participation. Participation not only by students, but obviously older adults as well. Democracy is based on the idea that people know what's best for themselves and ought to be able to express their own voices. And this has to be ingrained in students so that they will become not only participating students, but young adults and older adults as well, and really make the direction of the country go where they want it to go.
Now, going from the First Amendment, obviously that freedom of expression, and obviously selecting who you want to be in office to carry out those public policies, let's shift a little to the Second Amendment briefly before we wrap for today. We're running out of time.
Okay.
The Second Amendment obviously is a key part of the whole gun control issue. Former Justice Stevens has said publicly there needs to be a change to this.
Yes.
How easily do you think that would happen?
It would not happen at all easily. Under the Constitution, of course, for it to be amended, and of course that would also mean eliminating amendments, you need 2/3 vote in both houses of the Congress, House and Senate. You need 3/4 of the state legislators to ratify the amendment, proposed amendment, and given the I guess the word I want is loyalty to gun ownership that we have in this country, that's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen certainly in my lifetime, and I don't see it happening anytime soon. What makes more sense is regulation, common sense, reasonable regulation by the state and federal governments. The current Supreme Court interpretation of the Second Amendment bothers me. Up until 2008, until the Heller case, what was said by the courts was that, as the Second Amendment says, for the purposes of a well-regulated militia, people have the right to own guns. Well, the courts had always said that there had to be a tie-in to a militia. The Heller case took that out. And so it opens the door much more broadly to individual gun ownership.
Well, again, thank you, Dr. David Kanervo, Professor Emeritus here at Austin Peay State University, for speaking with us about gun control for our third installment here at 91.9. And I'm Micca Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs.